So, Sekiro is a great game. I've pumped a good number of hours into it, I've unlocked all the achievements, and I'm currently on my 5th playthrough of the game. Sekiro has introduced a wonderful combat system, methods of traversal, memorable boss fights, and an interesting story. However, I wouldn't say it's all rosy. As I've been playing through Sekiro, it has begun to reveal some flaws to me, especially on subsequent playthroughs, and not in ways that I had expected. Certainly this was some reason for concern when we found out the game would be lacking multiplayer and some customization, but the cracks in this otherwise great game have come from other places, which I'd like to get into. This video will contain spoilers for Sekiro, except for the endings, which I'm pretty satisfied by and don't feel the need to discuss as a negative. One thing that I loved about the Dark Souls series and Bloodborne is that there were games that you could always depend on for a good time, even as a high-leveled character. There was always PvP to be had, an area to clear, a boss to fight. You might want to try something else new in your build and respec or clear the game using a weapon that you weren't comfortable with. Something I like to do is to keep pushing the boundary on, say, how many souls or blood echoes I could carry at once to increase attention when facing enemies, knowing that death would bring about a frustrating but ultimately mitigatable setback. At the end of the day, you knew that your character would still end up being stronger, or you'd pick up enough interesting items to change up your gameplay or improve a weapon that you had. You had many different ways of changing the gameplay to keep it interesting, and I think the game that definitely did this the best was Bloodborne. Bloodborne's combat, while not as interesting as Sekiro in some respects, was just so much fun, with your ability to switch up beautifully designed and animated weapons to keep things interesting. Plus, I would wager that I have more hours clocked in Bloodborne than all of From's other games, meaning I could basically play the game on autopilot while watching or doing something else. Now, with Sekiro, we are a bit more limited in this regard. Sekiro's progression in the first playthrough is obviously great because everything is new and fresh, and you're constantly on the lookout for mini-bosses or prayer beads to make your relatively fragile character a bit more hardy. You're picking up every item just like you would in a Souls game, lapping up every tiny bit of content that you can. Now, normally this is fine for From games, as traditionally in their New Game Plus, some items are slightly different or are more powerful versions of what they were before. I'm sorry that I have to say it, friends, but Sekiro's New Game Plus is sort of average. This was the first game I was not excited to go into New Game Plus with because I knew that there wouldn't be that much variation from the first playthrough, and I was right. The changes as far as I've been able to notice is that you have Kuro's Charm, which actually helps you by giving you protection from chip damage if you block, and a 17% increase in XP and currency pickups. This does not matter much in either case, as we will get into shortly. Other changes occur, like instead of prayer beads from mini-bosses you'll get large sen pouches. In general you get a lot more sen and some other upgrade materials from enemies, but here's the issue. By New Game Plus, sen and the base upgrade materials are completely useless. Unless you haven't bought some one-off items like the Dragon Mask, currency in almost all items have no use to you. Something odd that is worth commenting on is the sen pouches. This was actually a great idea by FromSoft, a sort of way to invest your currency and protect it against loss on death. However, I can't see why the same wasn't done for XP gain. Once your first playthrough is complete, the goal for most players, I would imagine, would be to unlock the remainder of the Shinobi arts for achievements or otherwise. The issue here is that, number one, enemies in general do not drop any items that increase XP gain, even temporarily, and secondly, and inexplicably, From Software did not implement any sort of item that is poppable XP, like a Souls packet or a Blood Echoes packet. We literally have poppable sen pouches, but not poppable XP items. This doesn't make any sense because in previous games they've allowed you a chance to either make back what you have lost or at least keep items on hand that can give XP at a later time, and XP in Sekiro is far more valuable than sen. You might say that it doesn't have to be the same because it's not a Souls game, it's fair enough, but at the same time it is a step backwards, it's hamstringing itself, all because sen becomes useless after basically the first playthrough, maybe the second playthrough, while Souls are always useful as a universal currency to buy things as well as to upgrade your character. And a frustrating factor is that bosses and enemies don't even drop that much XP to begin with, and most of the time if you die you're going to lose an absolute inordinate amount of XP, especially on New Game Plus, that takes forever to get back. I'm not complaining about the difficulty of the game, mind you, because playing without Kuro's charm with the demon bell on makes the game significantly more difficult than before, but I should not have to have almost 80 hours in my playthrough with my sole focus now about getting a huge amount of XP just to unlock 2 Shinobi arts that I'll never use, and just to get the achievement, that sense of completion. Grinding always had some sort of purpose in Souls, because you could use it to sequence break or skip huge areas of the game if you're trying to get a certain item or get yourself powerful enough to continue, but in Sekiro this doesn't seem to exist outside of abusing design flaws or speedrunning tactics. Something else regarding items in the game, and rewards, is the fact that exploration or gathering items past your first playthrough really has no point. I'm not talking about Sen anymore, I'm talking about any items at all. Ceramic shards, fistfuls of ash, sugars, all of them become completely meaningless after you get past a certain point. And this is a shame, because one of my favourite things to do in past Souls games is to play them with a randomization mod enabled, meaning that every item pickup would be randomised from the original loot table, meaning that for a while at least your first playthrough would be restricted to a certain number of items, armour and weapons. This would never work for Sekiro because no matter the order of items you pick up, it's never going to fundamentally change the way that you play. It's a shame because there is literally no reason for you to waste your time facing mini-bosses in New Game Plus and beyond if you've collected all the prayer beads, because they do not give you anything worth even close to a prayer bead, which were always items I looked forward to finding because they would either help me out going forward or let me know a little bit about the world in terms of the lore. Also, the fact that killing 5 or 6 normal enemies in New Game Plus gives the same amount of XP that you would be getting for killing a mini-boss is atrocious. It's unbalanced. There needs to be a more diversified method of giving rewards in this instance. Another note on rewards is what you get for killing various bosses. All bosses give you a memory of their fight, which you can use to upgrade your attack power by 1 point. There are a few issues with this, one being the fact that you will essentially get the exact same benefit, or less of the same benefit, of using the memory of a first boss versus the last boss due to diminishing returns on attack power. Why was this set up the way it was? I mean, that means I'm getting the same reward for fighting one of the easiest bosses in the game versus one of the hardest in the entire From Software history of games. It makes no sense because the same wouldn't apply in Dark Souls or Bloodborne. You're not going to get the same amount of, say, souls for fighting the gargoyles versus fighting Gwyn. But the really sad thing is that you could have easily remedied this by giving other boss rewards besides memories. For instance, Gyobu gives you a memory, but why not his spear? In fact, his spear is found in the Ashina Reservoir. Why force the player to find this prosthetic far further on when it could have been given as soon as you defeat the enemy who had the item in the first place? I understand that lore-wise the item is technically different from the one that Gyobu used, but I'm sure the prosthetic could still have been fashioned from this spear, or it could have been designed in a fact that you actually take the prosthetic from him. Lady Butterfly is another example. You get the Sakura droplet from her, but why not the kunai that can be used to make the shuriken prosthetic? Instead you have to buy this, and by the time I got it, it was pretty much useless. It would make more sense if it was an item that could be received early in the game through, say, a challenging fight to make other areas of the game more manageable. However, one of the most frustrating elements of this game to me, it doesn't really affect the whole game, but it's a little bit of an oversight in my opinion, relates to a boss, and I feel that was totally overlooked by From Software, and it's the tutorial area. Obviously, as most of you know, you get out of the well where you were surprisingly not even locked in, retrieve Kuro, and try to escape, but are then stopped by Genichiro. Now, let's rewind. The main issue with this area is that you receive no sort of XP for killing any of the enemies in this area, which also includes a mini-boss, and most disappointingly of all, you receive no XP or reward of any kind for defeating Genichiro in your first encounter. Here's a fight you are supposed to lose to, I understand that, but it is very strange that you receive nothing at all. Let's suppose for a moment that you fought him tooth and nail on your first playthrough, maybe quitting terminating the fight if you thought you would die but wanted another try, and then finally succeeded, only to receive no sort of reward. I was looking forward to fighting him again in New Game Plus, but it was a bit miffed to realise that I didn't get anything apart from a different cutscene. It would have made sense to be given a battle memory or something to give you an edge in the starting area, seeing as if you beat him then, you would clearly have enough skill to breeze past the first area. Or even better, skip the Ashina outskirts completely and spawn inside the Ashina castle or something as a prisoner for a totally new start. Even when you beat Genichiro later in the game, you don't receive anything other than a memory, when it could have been a perfect time to supply you with a Shinobi Arm that allows you to use lightning or something like that. In fact, there are no items in the entire game that allow you to use lightning other than in a counter, which is very effective against enemies. It would have been nice to get something like this, even as an endgame item or skill. Let's talk about Shinobi Skills for a moment. It would seem that the only skills worth having are Ichimonji in certain circumstances, High Monk, Shadow Rush, Mikiri Counter, and Puppeteer or Blood Smoke in the case of ninjutsu. All the others, and there are quite a few of them, are either just nice to have or not even worth talking about. Why did this seem to be a better system than allocating points? Let's say that getting a memory for a boss allowed you to choose to master one skill or something, or allocate 5 points to a stealth level, or speed level, or something. If you think about maybe in Bloodborne, from the very start of the game, you're given a choice. You're given a choice if you want to use the Hunter's Axe, the Cleaver, or the Cane. And depending on your choice, you can play through either the entire game or large chunks of the game in a very different way, playthrough to playthrough. But we're not really given anything like that in Sekiro, despite being told that this is going to be a very diversified way in the game, in the way that how you could face enemies and face different fights using the prosthetic arm and so on. I can't believe that this was the best system that they settled on, to be honest with you. Mikiri and High Monk are definitely the most practical and the most fun, as they allow you to deal with almost any perilous attack, but the others don't seem to have much of a practical use at all, and that's a real shame. One more thing is the fact that some of the attacks like Spiral Cloud Passage cost a massive 9 XP levels to unlock and cost spirit emblems to use and is almost completely useless. I think it took me fighting say between 4 to 5 bosses in New Game Plus 4 or 5 just to get into a position when I could unlock this, and that was also on top of grinding, which I did in end game areas. Aside from the fact that it took forever to grind, it's just sort of insulting that both the animators and myself, that clearly someone took the time to create a great looking attack and it has no real practical use whatsoever. Also, why is there no skill to increase the chance of unseen aid? The cap should have been set lower and then allowed to raise to say 50% or something by spending XP on skills. Strange choice. Next, what I want to talk about, and what was really surprising, is the practicality of the Shinobi Arm. When I was watching the competition that VatiVidya held that looked at the community suggestions of prosthetic tools, I was amazed at the different creations and all the different ways any of the designs could influence gameplay. But I had confidence that From Software could supply some prosthetic attachments that could really shake things up, as they have before with weapons and magic and all those other great things. And I was sort of wrong, unfortunately. Obviously the prosthetic is a really cool idea and the grappling hook is a lot of fun to move around with, but the tools themselves are not really that great or interesting. There's a firecracker, which I'm sure everyone used a lot on their first playthrough, but ultimately all it's giving you is a few free hits on an enemy, so it's more of a crutch than a gameplay modifier. There's the Divine Abduction, which spins enemies around and makes them disappear in certain areas, but again, this isn't that interesting. There's the Mistraven Feathers, which I've barely used, but again, don't seem that groundbreaking. The use of Shuriken are really incidental, as is the axe, and so on. There isn't enough for me to really talk about in a constructive manner. The worst element, though, I feel, is the laser light upgraded prosthetics. The fact that these need to be upgraded across 2 playthroughs essentially is ridiculous, and the fact that they aren't even that useful is really insulting. The laser light axe is good for the corrupted monk fight, and the firecracker is helpful to be delayed sometimes, but the others don't really make any sort of groundbreaking difference. I'm talking about this so much because with previous From games, they were the masters of introducing gameplay changes to the player that made a huge difference to how you would play. With Dark Souls you had sorcery, pyromancy, summoning, and a huge arsenal, and with Bloodborne the weapons alone and the DLC gave you reason to play through the game multiple times, and happily so. The strangest thing about all this is that From Software really pushed the envelope that the prosthetic was going to be this constantly evolving part of the game that would help you with all these sorts of different situations, but it really doesn't. Once you have become experienced enough, you just end up deflecting with your sword all the time. And this wouldn't be so much of an issue if there were other weapons or fighting styles to try out, but essentially every fight comes down to you deflecting a sword and countering. Another surprising factor is this is a single player game, which you would think would give From more flexibility when applying totally new gameplay mechanics, but it seems like it's been a more stripped down approach. Something else I want to talk about is stealth. Stealth was another factor with Sekiro that was marketed a lot, but it doesn't seem to have much use or impact on gameplay as we were told. On your first playthrough, you're operating with the mindset that stealth is very important. You're unsure if enemies will change in terms of how they hunt you if you become revealed or leave a trail behind. Unfortunately, once you play for a while, this illusion melts away and you realize that stealth doesn't really matter that much. Enemies don't react to finding dead bodies, they won't spread out to find you or anything like that. There could have been an element of enemies changing to challenge your methods, like equipping more armor to their backs to make stealth takedowns harder, for instance. NPCs are something else I take a bit of issue with. In previous Souls games and Bloodborne, NPCs and their quest lines were always a bit finicky, but generally led to an interesting reward of sorts. In Sekiro, however, I feel like the questline rewards are severely lacking. Jinzaemon gives a Buddha statue that operates exactly the same as any of the others, and this is after a fairly lengthy questline, which at any point you could have betrayed him to get an equally useless item. Well, actually, I shouldn't say useless, they aren't, but the fact that they don't really act to change gameplay at all is a letdown. In Bloodborne, for instance, you had the quest to get the Milkweed rune that would allow you to become a broccoli man and play with a new moveset. Why doesn't something like this exist in Sekiro? Maybe it'll change in the DLC, but right now the base game does not really offer that much in terms of replayability. I've just finished unlocking all the achievements and now I have almost no compulsion to play the game. And this applies to the vendors as well. Merchants and vendors in previous Souls games have always been interesting, as occasionally they have progression quest lines or something to expand their wares, but in Sekiro this is all done by a group called the Memorial Mob, who pretty much sell all the same thing with some exceptions. The thing is, you never have to return to any of these NPCs after buying what you need from them. It just feels a bit empty. It's not like I expect all From games to be the same thing every time, but I expect them to learn from their mistakes, but also keep the things that worked so well in the past. I want them to go forward in creating the best possible game that they can make, and in several aspects I see them take a step backwards. Why do we have something like the ceremonial Tanto, which gives you spirit emblems by sacrificing vitality, and it can only be used 3 times per rest? We had this ability in Bloodborne to use health to get Quicksilver bullets from the start, and you could use it as many times as you want. Another thing is the music, unfortunately. From Software is well known for creating amazing musical scores for their games with so many iconic tracks. In Sekiro, however, apart from a few tracks which I will concede are really good, like the Hirata Estates music, the Folding Monkey music, the Corrupted Monk, and so on, it's a shame though, because in Bloodborne, for instance, there were so many tracks that I would listen to outside of the game because they were so damn good. One part of the Souls series that has always been weak was the Covenant system. They're somewhat inaccessible for PvE players and don't always work as intended for PvP players. As Sekiro is a single player game, it might have been a good idea to try out a PvE Covenant and see what it would be like. You might say it's a bit out of character for Sekiro to do this, but still he shows his ability to act in spite of his oaths quite a lot. You could have had an Okami Covenant, a Ministry Covenant, one for the dragon, and so on. It's just a pity because it definitely would have been something to encourage extra playthroughs. All of these are a lot of scattershot thoughts, but there just seems to be a lack of actual rewards in the game that are scalable to what sort of player you are. Take the headless enemies for example. Quite frightening, difficult to fight at first, but the reward they give you is pretty boring and ultimately useless. They give you items that basically allow you to continually use sugars that increase posture, defense, attack, and stealth. Now, personally, the only sugars I ever used were the attack sugar, and it's only a 12% increase in attack power. So is there really a point to it? The headless enemies should give something that adds a brand new mechanic rather than just bolstering items that you've been picking up through the whole game. Something else that has pretty much come up as an issue in most of From's games is reused assets. Dark Souls 1 didn't really suffer this way in terms of bosses, but Bloodborne, Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 did. In Sekiro it also features, and in a pretty unfortunate way. There are technically 17 bosses in the game, but if you discount the reskins of bosses, you end up with 14, and that's counting Ishin twice because in my mind both encounters are different. That means 20% are essentially reused. In comparison, Dark Souls 2 has 31 bosses, and that's after I take off the number of reskins. I'm in no way saying that Dark Souls 2 is better, so put down your pitchforks, but obviously the quality of the bosses in Sekiro are way beyond most, if not all of the DS2 bosses, but you get my point. With FromSoft in the position that they're in, I should not be going up against the same bosses again and again. If I beat Genichiro fair and square in the tutorial, I should not have to face him again until the end of the game. That would have made a lot more sense. Lastly, I'll just sum up a few little things that irked me a bit, but otherwise these aren't huge issues. Sekiro was focused on telling a more complete story this time around, which I totally appreciate. That's fine, and it tells it well, but in doing that, it's sort of taken out a whole world building aspect from From's other games that what they were so famous for. Across the Dark Souls and Bloodborne games are hundreds, maybe even thousands of item descriptions that add to your understanding of the world, characters, kingdoms, and so on. We still have that to an extent in Sekiro, but keep in mind that they have dramatically wound back the number of different items you get, which has essentially made the explorable sea of lore a lot more shallow than usual. They could have also introduced elements that might not be even usable as weapons, but maybe just quick items. With all the supernatural stuff going on in Sekiro, I was surprised we never get some sort of occult ability or weapon, aside from maybe the Mortal Blade, which isn't used that much anyway. The last thing I want to talk about is Dragon Rot. Dragon Rot was advertised as something that could really increase the tension in the game, and it totally could have, but it was not implemented that way. You sort of have the illusion, like when it comes to the stealth mechanics, that Dragon Rot could really cause some of the characters to die, but it can't, really. It's a total shame because it could have been something that was always on your mind and would have made the fights even more tense, knowing that another death might bring the deaths of some of the other characters, but instead, none of that ever happens. It could have been an ending when it becomes Sekiro's goal, for some reason, to spread Dragon Rot to everyone and just kills himself over and over again, similar to the Undead Warrior. I don't know. There could have been something done with it. All in all, though, I think that's pretty much my gripes with the game. And that is after I've really enjoyed it. I've obviously grinded because I wanted to get every last achievement in the game to really enjoy this title that I've been looking forward to playing for so long. But in a lot of ways, I don't really have any sort of compulsion to go back and play it, which is sad because even with Dark Souls 1, 2, 3, Bloodborne, Demon Souls, I still get that itch to play them once in a while. Maybe I've just played too much of Sekiro in too short of time, but still, this is kind of the way I feel, and I'd be interested to see what you feel as well. So if you have any thoughts that add on to these, or you want to comment on something that I said, let me know down below. I love reading what you guys think about the games. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more Sekiro and Dark Souls content. Until next time.